iron is a necessary element for all living things. And as far as human beings go, we have finely tuned iron regulatory mechanisms, hormones, and so on that regulate the absorption of iron from our food. So at least in theory, if somebody is very metabolically healthy and everything else is right, when people get to a certain level of body iron stores, basically the regulatory system will really kind of shut down the absorption of iron, so you keep that in fine tune. In practice, many people are not metabolically healthy, and there are sources of iron that we didn't necessarily have before. You know, for example, flour and cornmeal in the United States is mostly iron fortified, and people take multivitamins with iron supplements and, you know, this kind of thing. So the result is that generally speaking, people's iron level, body iron stores, as indicated by the marker ferritin, rises with age. And this has been shown to be associated with all kinds of ill health and higher mortality and so on. This whole line of reasoning and investigation basically started when the late Jerome Sullivan, several decades ago, was thinking about, well, why do women have such lower rates of heart disease? And, you know, at the time, and for all I know, maybe still now, a lot of people are saying, well, they have estrogen and various things that, you know, prevent heart disease. And he thought, oh, well, gee, women have much, you know, premenopausal women have much lower stores of body iron. Their ferritin is low. And, you know, in middle age, like, you know, let's say between the age of 40 and 50, men have about something like 4 to 5 times the levels of ferritin that women do, and they also have about 4 or 5 times the rates of heart attacks as women do at that age. So that's where it all started. There's been a lot of research. Iron is important, for instance, in cancer. Cancer is a rapidly growing tissue. Anything that is growing requires iron for growth. Many tumor cells upregulate transferrin receptors so that they can accumulate a lot of iron. Another side of this evidence is that, and again, this research goes back a few decades, and there's more recent research too, that blood donors have better health than non-blood donors. Now, of course, you run into a big problem there, which is the healthy donor effect, because you got to be healthy to donate blood. And not only that, probably people who don't feel so healthy are not even going to try. But this has been looked at as well, you know, trying to statistically account for the healthy donor effect, is, you know, to see how much of this is real. And it certainly does appear to be real. There was a paper that came out a few years ago that said that, so one thing they do to account for the healthy donor effect is they look at, for example, they compare frequent donors with non-frequent donors. So, you know, this doesn't necessarily account for the whole thing, but at least you're not comparing just blood donors to non-donors. So anyway, they looked at this and found that it was something like every blood donation beyond 2 donations a year was associated with 7.5% lower mortality rate. I think I got that right. So this was trying to account for the healthy donor effect. They've also looked at things like in some countries, people are not allowed to give blood after the age of 65. So they compare current blood donors with former blood donors. And so anyway, that's the whole thing with iron. And so the idea is, oh, and also let me add another part to this. Um, Therapeutic phlebotomy, in other words, bleeding people, bloodletting, does all kinds of good things for metabolic syndrome and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, all this kind of thing. So iron is a very reactive metal, and can cause oxidative stress, does um, all kinds of bad things. So keeping body iron levels low is in a low normal range, I should say, is the thing to do for good health and longevity.
So it's not just looking at iron by itself, but iron with ferritin, or could you look at iron by itself as a biomarker?
Right. So basically, no, in most cases, you have to look at ferritin. Now, so this brings up an interesting point, because the iron that is causing trouble in the body, that causes damage and so on, is what they would call free iron or labile iron. In other words, this is iron that is not bound by the protein molecule ferritin. So the question is, well, so if you donate blood, for example, you lower your ferritin. Does that but in my book, I use the analogy that, for example, if you look at dynamite, okay, so dynamite is, allegedly, if it's just sitting there, it's all safe, until you do something to it, like, I don't know, light a fuse, whatever they do to dynamite, it's okay. But you wouldn't necessarily want to store a case of dynamite in your house. And so that's the analogy I use with ferritin. So if the iron atoms are locked into the ferritin molecule, then there's no problem. But in practice, this whole system becomes dysregulated. One of the late Dr. Leo Zakarsky, who wrote the preface to my book, and he had done a lot of work on iron. He talked to me about, for instance, the ferritin molecule can become glycosylated if somebody has high glucose excursions or generally high blood sugar. It can become glycosylated, and then just doesn't work properly, and it leaks iron. So in that sense, yeah, getting the ferritin down to a low normal level is helpful in that way.
So probably looking at both, right? Not looking at only at iron levels in blood, but also ferritin. Probably measuring both would be a good idea, because if you only have the iron, you don't know the ferritin, and if you only have the ferritin, you don't know the iron, right? So
So if you're looking at serum iron, um, yes, it does become dysregulated sometimes, but the damage of the iron is going on inside cells. And so this gets really technical into sort of the kind of territory a hematologist would be looking at, iron and transferrin and total iron saturation and all these kind of things. Um, so there are a number of studies that have been done, I don't know, a few decades ago, where they were looking at, what were they looking at? Transferrin, I guess, or iron saturation. But this is just not as if somebody has a high iron saturation, that generally means they're absorbing too much iron. So like they might have hemochromatosis, or at least some gene variant that is causing them to absorb too much iron.
interesting. So then maybe it's not just looking at iron as a biomarker and ferritin, but total iron binding capacity, right? Because if that's high,
Right.
you've got a lot of iron being released from hemoglobin and wherever else it's coming from, and that's indicative of cellular damage. And for whatever reason, whether it's microbes causing it or your cells are just dysfunctional, right? So
Right. Right.
interesting. Wow. Yeah. So what I didn't even think I was going to bring in microbes into it, but do you think microbes, when considering gut leak, um, there could be a blood microbiome that maybe just overgrowth during aging. Do you think that that's a component in the iron equation since microbes compete with human cells for iron, where
Yeah, that's interesting. And you know, I'm not sure. I only have an idea or two about that. You know, one thing that I found so interesting was recently I learned this is so two genera of bacteria that are generally considered probiotic, namely Lactobacillus and Bifidobacterium, do not require iron at all. They are like one of the very few species, you know, genera, you know, life forms, whatever we want to call it, that do not require iron. And you know, it seemed curious to me that the fact that they don't require iron and they are considered healthy for the gut, you know, is that related? Um, One thing I could say is that as far as you know, the gut goes, well, the liver is the first organ to, you know, to see basically see the contents, you know, what's coming in from the gut. And of course we get, you know, fatty liver and cirrhosis and things like that. Iron is involved in that, definitely. You know, it's free iron, of course. um, an interesting thing, kind of as an aside, you know, a lot of people don't know this, but being on Twitter, I'm sure you do, you see all the stuff about seed oils,
yeah.
right? And what they're doing, and as far as they polyunsaturated fats are very reactive molecules and lead to you know, oxidative stress, molecular damage, and so on. So what's going on there? Well, at least in many cases, it appears to be it's a combination of polyunsaturated fats and free iron. The free iron is reacting with the polyunsaturated fats to create this problem. This is exactly you know, you know about this too, lipofuscin. So you know, this is the so-called age pigment that builds up inside lysosomes and just basically totally messes up the cell. It's been called the garbage catastrophe of aging because it's garbage that the cell can't get rid of. What's lipofuscin made of? It's made of polyunsaturated fats and iron,
Mhm.
and then it just it messes up the protein molecules and then just forms all this junk. And so it's, yeah, iron and polyunsaturated fats. That's what causes the buildup of lipofuscin.
So microbes potentially playing a role in that process outside of the lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. Um, so
Yeah,
for example, if you know, like in the gut, if there can be like you know, the degradation of the mucus layer, so now the bacteria can get into
right.
the epithelial cells. So could there be a situation where the microbes had infected a cell and you know it's inside the cell? You know and maybe that's a part of autoimmunity. I mean, this is speculation, right? But could there be a process where microbes are competing for iron and then there's cellular damage as a result? Iron is released as a part of that process, which then is a cascade of you know horrors for the body, right? So.
Right. So yes, for one thing, well, what's interesting is that yeah, so all bacteria, microorganisms, apparently, other than Lactobacillus and Bifidobacterium, all require iron. And if we're talking about pathogenic bacteria that invade the human body, iron is absolutely the limiting element for their growth. They absolutely have to have iron. So they have developed ways to acquire iron, and we have developed ways to withhold it from them. This has been called an evolutionary arms race, where it, you know, like our transferrin molecules, for example, have grown to become ever, you know, to hold iron ever tighter and tighter and tighter, you know, so that bacteria can't get them. And then the bacteria or other microorganisms have developed ways like siderophores. So these are, you know, that the proteins and that they secrete into their environment that grab iron. Um, so whether, whether that's, uh, well, another thing is that when people are critically ill, or they have severe injuries, that this can lead to the release of free iron, and then you have the bacteria or other microorganisms swooping in because they've got all this free iron, and then you see infections and so on. um, Whether that dynamic has anything to do with, disordered iron metabolism, as most people would experience it, I couldn't say.
Yeah, I don't know. That's the next step in this evolution of the story, right? Are microbes causing it?
Right.
Causing the leak, but who knows, right? So